Hello everybody, welcome to this month's second flight of things on eBay. We are putting 20 items up. I've had a lot of fun curating these. I'm excited to share the stories with you. Thank you very much to our level 2 and 3 members. You are getting early access, seeing it while these things drop live on eBay. And if you are not a member and are interested in that, click the join button if you see it, or check the memberships in the description below, and you can find out all about that. In the meantime, you can go to the description and hit that link and go right to the item and see if it is still for sale, and if not, how it did and what it sold for. So it's a chance to learn as well as a chance to shop. We'll just go right to showing you cool stuff because we've got a bunch this time. This is our second flight of eBay items for the month because we were a little delayed last month with family matters, and one thing we did as an experiment is we tried some large objects and they sold for good prices. So since this is a good example of a large item that should sell for a good price, we're going to try this too. It is Ydro, and Ydro is very well made. They usually don't attribute their artists, but I did a little research and found out this was made by Antonio Luis, and he also did their Cinderella. He also did Othello and Desdemona, so he was one of their better sculptors because that's who they did do these larger items. There's the Ydro mark on the bottom. This is mold number 4750, and it was retired at some point around 1990. There's different scholarship on what year it was actually retired from the line. I think it depended what part of the world you're in, but it hasn't been made in about 35 years, and that's the reason that these are going online for around $300. I see them listed retail as much as $750, so I thought it was worth giving a shot. It's not going to be the easiest thing to pack, but Kat at Nurse Flipper introduced me to these. This is an Instapak Quick RT, and you take this out, there's got a couple of liquid components in it. You rub it really fast and it forms around the item that you're hoping to ship. So I think that with this we can get it to somebody safely. There is a buy it now on it, so if somebody really loves it, it can be yours right away. Last month we didn't do any buy it nows. This month we're going to experiment a little and see what might sell buy it now versus what might sell at auction on a 10-day auction. It's part of the reason we do these listings is to experiment, play around with eBay a little bit and see what gives better results depending on the kind of merchandise we're selling. So we'll see how that goes, but it's a beautiful piece and I think someone will enjoy it. This next item I think is really neat because the graphics are so great. I know we have some other YouTube resellers who love this sort of thing, and I know that we have a lot of collectors out there who really like early American advertising. This is chromolithography from about 1890. We know 1890 because this is Buckingham cut plug smoking tobacco. It's got a very Victorian aesthetic to it, and it says it's John J. Bagley and Company, the American Tobacco Company successor manufacturing. And that is because American Tobacco Company took over about 200 smaller tobacco companies around 1890 and created a monopoly. That same year, the Sherman Antitrust Act was formed, and so by 1911, American Tobacco was broken up into R.J. Reynolds, Liggett and Myers, American Tobacco, which is now Fortune Brands, and Lorillard. We'll see something from Lorillard here in a minute. But Tobacciana is very collectible. This is a pocket-sized tin. Remarkable about it is that you can see that, yes, the seal has been broken, but in reality, this has never actually been used. And I'm going to open the lid and show you the inside, where there's been no oxygen, looks like new. And it's got the original wax paper with even a little flake of tobacco on there that has been in this for over 120 years. And that's the reason that this particular one should do really well at auction. I expect that this will go for a minimum of 100. I know that Morford's Auction in Michigan recently sold one for over 300 that was in similar condition, and that is because they are one of the biggest auction houses for antique advertising memorabilia in the country. And they are not the only ones who smoke cigars. Our friend here will come up a little later and we'll talk about him and why he is a famous cigar smoker of a different era. This third piece is another big thing, but I actually would rather try to ship this on eBay than take it to a show because I'm afraid of the shade getting crunched if it's bouncing around in my van. So we're going to try this online first. It's a chalk figure from about 1950 in the form of a lamp, and this is advertising Dutch Boy Paints. Dutch Boy Paints was formed around 1907 by the National Lead Company, but this piece you can tell by the great shade. It's amazing. It's got this original woven cardboard shade with the modeling on it. It's unbelievable that still exists. I've never seen one with the shade before. This was done as an advertising piece around 1950. There's one little scrape of paint off of one of his clogs, which could be retouched, but I did not want to do that. I wanted it to be very clear what the condition actually is and let the person who gets it make that decision. But his little paintbrush is all there. None of this has been broken and re-glued, so it's all in perfect condition as far as the structure of the piece goes. It probably said Dutch Boy here maybe on a cardboard card, or was supposed to, or maybe they would put the name of the retailer in there and it wasn't used. It's just clean as a whistle. You can see on the bottom here that it actually has a tag for the Roman Art Company, and this was another of the big chalkware makers who did Robiaware, as they called it. They were based in St. Louis, and so they made this piece again around 1950. It's just a really fun piece. Dutch Boy came about because Lawrence Carmichael Earl, who was the painter who painted the Dutch Boy for the advertising, well, he was living in New York, but at the time he'd originally grown up near Grand Rapids, Michigan, and they went to Holland, Michigan, the town founded by a lot of Dutch settlers that really celebrated the Dutch traditions. And because of that, he was influenced to paint this as the logo, and Dutch Boy became the name of National Lead Company's paints. After lead got phased out of house paint around 1978, they sold out to Sherwin-Williams. So you still see Dutch Boy, but it's part of a bigger company now. And they don't put lead in their paint anymore. Again, I'm not afraid to ship large objects if I think that they're worth enough, and I think that they will do better with a national audience, and I think that's a great example of one that fits both of those criteria. We are starting that at $99. Our buy it now is $350 because they are actually pretty difficult to find, so we'll see if a serious collector steps right up for it. Now, this next piece is Medalta Potteries, and I really like Medalta. You may remember this piece. My friend in Spokane had me take it to a show to try to sell. You can see it's got the signature June 4th, 1940, because this is when Churchill gave his very inspirational speech stating that we shall not flag or fail. And so there's Churchill. This was so psychically important for the nations of the British Empire, and Medalta was made in Medicine Hat, Alberta. So it made perfect sense that they came up with this. This is a very scarce piece. There's the Medalta Potteries Medicine Hat, copyright, serial number, and Carter Scott signed on the bottom as well. So this is a very hard to find piece. Medalta is a great company. They actually formed along the rail lines in Medicine Hat, Alberta around the end of the First World War. And they quickly became really, really famous all over Canada. They were the first company west of Manitoba to ship merchandise back to Eastern Canada all the way to Quebec and the Maritime provinces. And because of that, Medalta became very well known for stoneware and earthenware. And they really peaked about 1940 when this piece was made because they started to be able to outsell the Robinson Ramsbottom Company of Ohio that had supplied most of Eastern Canada with its ceramics up until then. Medicine Hat was a perfect place because they could get good clay from Saskatchewan, and they had lots of natural gas to fire furnaces. You can still tour the old factory. The old brick kilns are still there. I've been there. I thought it was really fascinating. It's a great museum. They'll tell you all about the process and how these ceramics were made. And they lasted until the mid-50s, and then the Japanese competition took them out of the market along with a lot of the American potters. So that was the end of Medalta, but they had a good run, and it is a really unusual piece for them. And that's why, again, I'm pricing these up. I'm going to start this around $75 because I haven't seen one online for months and months and months, and I think that they're actually rather scarce. And oh, Canada, I certainly seem to have a Canadian bent in this particular episode because this is another Canadian piece with a great heritage. This is a Canadian Pacific wool blanket from the late 1940s, and you can tell it's late 40s because it's definitely that stiff old wool, but it's got these great stripes. This color combination was very popular in the 40s. This would have been used in a smaller sleeping car berth because it's actually a fairly wide piece. Okay, it does have one little teeny tiny hole in it that I should point out if I can even find it again. It's probably about a twin size. It would have been plenty for a railroad car berth in that time. And this would have been just after the Second World War, when the trains are starting to run a lot of passengers again, and a lot of people are taking Canadian Pacific trains through the Rocky Mountains. Canadian Pacific started as the government-funded line back in the 1870s. It took a while, about 15 years, for them to get all the way to Vancouver. The coast-to-coast linkage meant that you didn't have to take a 4-month boat trip around the country from Halifax. That united Canada and made it possible to stave off incursion from the United States. There was a lot of talk at that time that even though Canada technically went to the Pacific, that it would eventually get cut off and just be a small area in the center of North America, and that the United States would take over everything else. So it was very significant that the Canadian Pacific came to be. It's got the beaver on top of the shield. It's just a cool piece. These were sold at the 1986 Expo in Vancouver because one of the big attractions there was the Roundhouse. It was one of the only buildings on the site that was kept. It was an old industrial area, but the old CP Roundhouse was right in the middle of it, and so they kept that, and that was where these were sold. And so that's how it came to me. We're going to start that at about $50, and it should be worth about double that. We'll see what Canadian files we have in the audience and out there on YouTube, and try to find it a new home. This little guy I wanted to show under a really bright light. This is Swarovski. It is the frog prince with the little crown on his head. But a lot of people wouldn't recognize it as Swarovski because there is the mark. It is the S in the box. That mark was discontinued in favor of the swan mark that most people know about 1980, which means a whole lot of people are missing out on buying these pieces. I found this in the wild for a very inexpensive price because the estate sale company did not recognize the Swarovski mark before the swan mark. So they had other swan mark pieces marked at $30 and $40, and this one came to me for a lot less. $30 and $40 is in fact what this should sell for. So we will put it out at $9.99 and let our Swarovski collectors tell us what they think of this really beautiful and very whimsical piece of crystal. This next piece is something a viewer saw in a video of mine and asked if I could please talk about it a little bit and explain what the deal with these are, because she said she's finding them out there and she's been buying and collecting them, but she was really surprised when I told her that this one was worth somewhere between $60 and $100. Well, this particular aluminum casserole is part of a long-standing line by a long-standing sculptor by the name of Don Drumm. Don Drumm went to Kent State, studied art, graduated, and did various work, has been awarded by the American Institute of Architecture, and is really well known. He still has a gallery in Akron, Ohio, where he's from. This says Drumm 1980, 3-quart, 3-liter. These casserole dishes of various styles have been made as far back as 1969 by him. This one, if you go to his gallery, is out of stock, meaning that it is no longer in production and they don't have any more of them. And that's the reason why the prices on Don Drumm's stuff is going up. It's so brutalist. It's such an amazing modernist design if you look at it. And it's all just sculptural. And he really just has a lot of fun with it. It has a real brutalist, yes, but almost folksy, primitive aspect to it as well. Look at the handles. I mean, they definitely look hand-formed. I think it's fascinating, and I am excited to put it out and have somebody end up with this. Yes, it is heavy, but it's a nice, not breakable thing. If we pack it well, it should ship just fine. and the opening price on that one is going to be around $49. I expect that it will probably sell for about double that. That seems to be where the market is for this particular one. When they were selling it new from the factory, it was $268. Well, milk does a body good. That's one of the slogans that we've heard from the dairy industry over the years. And in the 1930s, they were trying to encourage people to drink more milk because in the 20s, they realized there was a lot of overproduction and that lasted into the Depression. And so the government started to subsidize dairying, and then they wanted to help promote it more. So they added it to the list of food groups that people were supposed to have. And they did lots of marketing to children to get them to drink more milk, not just on cereal, but anytime. And so you have this pencil sharpener. This belonged to a friend of mine who is 90 years old now, and he's decided to part with it, but he got it when he was in the 1930s, when he was somewhere around 6 or 7 years old as a novelty. You could hang it on a chain. That's why it has a hole through it. He had a little bit of fun with it. You can tell it's a little bit worn from use, but I just am so delighted to put it out on the market for him. We found it in his desk drawer when he was moving into assisted living, and he said, "Oh my goodness, I'd forgotten I even had that thing." So we figured that it should go from obscure thing lost in a desk drawer to a new generation who might use this, I don't know, maybe in a doll display or a display of miniatures. I also have customers out in Washington who have a Darigold dairy. Maybe they'll spot this. It's hard to say where these things will go, but that's part of the fun of putting them online, is to give everybody a chance at them and find out who the customer it's supposed to go with is. That one we're going to start at $9.99 with no buy it now. Obviously, it could also sell to somebody who collects novelty pencil sharpeners. I like things that are cross-collectible. It really is important, especially if you're going to list things on auction. You want things that are more unique, that can hit more different markets, because you only have a limited time to try to sell them. I mentioned earlier that one of the companies that came out of the destruction of the American tobacco monopoly was Lorillard, and they had to do their own advertising. So right after that, in the 19-teens, they came out with poker chips that said, "Chew Lorillard's splendid plug tobacco," amongst other things. Poker chips with advertising really turned into a thing around the 1900 era. There was starting to be more limitation on gambling, just like there was on drinking. And so I think that all of these sin companies, quote unquote, got together and said, hey, we need to promote this relaxed way of life that suits our product and gives us our customers. And part of that is, well, people like to chew tobacco while they're playing poker, so what a better time to hit them with this advertising. It's a strange little thing. This also came from my friend's desk drawer. I just thought that they were the two most interesting odd things that he'd kept over the years, and we're going to start this one at $9.99 as well. Nowadays, of course, they wouldn't be able to do something like this. Joe Camel had a poker chip set, and boy, that sells for a bunch of money now, because a lot of this kind of swag is no longer allowed on the market. Now, this next piece is a company I really respect and haven't had a lot to show, so I thought I would put this little piece up to sell because we know this is a genuine piece of Rookwood. There are reproductions from this molded era, which was their last era of production. They started out as an artware maker, and the woman who founded it was the daughter of a wealthy winery owner. And she really was influenced by going to the 1876 World's Fair in Philadelphia and seeing all the beautiful art pottery. So she started the Rookwood Company in Cincinnati, hired a woman to be the art director, and the two of them did a lot of the early designs. They hired a lot of women artists. It was noteworthy for the time. This is in the 1880s. By the 1900s, they had Japanese artists coming to work with them. They did a whole line of that. They did Native American figural pieces. They got into vellum glazes where you could have a sort of frosty glaze and still see what was underneath. They did some really beautiful work, got into architectural pieces in the 20s. And then times got tough with the Depression. So like everyone else, they went to a lot of molded wares, and the molded wares are interesting because if you look at the Roman numerals, you know what date the piece was originally designed. So this one was 1927. Now the little hairs around the backwards R that makes up Rookwood Pottery, that logo you see above the Roman numerals, each of those little hairs is supposed to represent 1 year after 1927 that passed until this particular piece was made. And so this looks like it would be a piece made at some point during the Second World War era. I think it's just really sweet. Rookwood of all eras is collectible, and it's good to know that this is a real piece and not a reproduction, and that's why I thought I would bring it out here. This other mark is the mold number, so it's a form 2093, and this little piece is going to start at $59. And we're not doing a buy it now. We're just going to let people start with it. Maybe someone will get a bargain, and maybe it'll run up to a 3-digit level like perhaps it should. This, I think, is the most amazing little piece. I know it's far from Valentine's Day, but I just couldn't wait to put this out on the market because look how cute this is. In fantasy, I can picture you saying yes to this plea of mine, so keep cool and answer right away that you'll be my Valentine. The miniature fan is just amazing. It does spin. I'm going to do it very gently on its side because I don't want to mess up the card, but it spins, it rotates. It has a sort of brass colored base. It looks a lot like fans of about 1920 when this particular Valentine was made. For someone who loves Valentines, for someone who loves miniatures, the American Valentine really became a big thing in the 1850s. A woman named Esther Howland in Worcester, Massachusetts got a Valentine sent from France and was very intrigued and then started doing her own. She hired a bunch of paper cutters to do elaborate designs. By the 1880s, she sold out and made a bunch of money. She was selling over $100,000 worth a year, and the American Valentine industry really spread after that, and things became more and more elaborate until this piece made about 1920. So I just think it's really cool. I didn't want to try to store it for the next several months and hope that everything turned out and that it kept well. I just thought this was the time to put it out there. This is also going to be $9.99. So we have some fun things that we're just starting at a basic price and going to let the market tell us where it should be. Even the back of the fan looks like the back of a real fan. There we go. So I just think this is really neat, and I'm happy to have some things that I think are fun and interesting and absolutely collectible and somewhat remarkable for their type, but not necessarily $1 million. You can collect a lot of fun, interesting stuff that isn't necessarily expensive per se, but is intriguing and interesting to look at and fun to talk about and cool to show off. And I find so many different aspects of collecting fun for that reason. Long, long ago, before the connection to the poet Sappho and her strong voice towards women made people think of it differently, the island of Lesbos was a sweet little Aegean sea island in Greece, and it is a place that they grew a lot of dates, and that's why this box was made at some time right about 1910 to 1920. You can tell that by the graphics. You can also tell that by the way they use this wraparound with the little round nails. They're round rather than square, so they're early 20th century, but it is done a lot like a firkin where you just bend, or shaker boxes where you just bend the wood around. That's because this was just to get stuffed dates from Greece to the rest of the world. And so it says extra quality packed and guaranteed by the Lesbian Fruit Company Incorporated, Lesbian Stuffed Dates. Well, lesbian dates mean something different nowadays, of course, and somebody felt it very important to write this information down for us. So I just thought this was a lot of fun. It's obviously something that has a double meaning in modern day parlance, and as we saw a few months ago when I sold a certain pocket mirror, you can go back and watch that video. I won't say the name of it out loud without the mirror here to show. But the point is this sort of thing does sell, and it's a lot of fun. It's something that we wouldn't expect, and I think that we will put this out also at $9.99 and just see where it goes. So we have a lot of fun, interesting things that are starting at a low price, And the next one is this, because I thought it had been long enough that maybe we should talk about this person who was very, very famous in his time and unfortunately remains so now. And that is Orenthal James Simpson, OJ the Juice. He was one of the greatest football players in college and NFL history. He was the first player to get over 2,000 yards running in a season, and that was back when the season was only 14 games, so that was quite remarkable. He was averaging 140 yards a game, which is pretty crazy. By 1975, the advertising industry had discovered his desire and skills in the realm of acting. He had always wanted to be an actor and actually threatened not to go into football. He asked for a huge contract with the Buffalo Bills and said, if you don't give it to me, I'll just go become an actor. So they ended up giving him the biggest contract in history. By 1975, he was working for Hertz as a spokesman, and this is a really fun group of things. I mean, the inside is a lot of things like doodle artish coloring book stuff that was very popular graphically in the mid-70s, where you had these outlines and then colored in with new fancy colored ink pens, because felt pens were suddenly much more widely available. Here's your name search for all the NFL football teams. So this is basically something to give to kids when mom and dad had to rent a car and drag them off somewhere. And here's OJ doing his commercial. Look at the great cars there. You see a bunch of Ford Mustangs in the background there because they were relatively economical, and that was right after the first gas crisis. So it's very much a period piece. OJ, of course, had his own adventure with cars when he did the slow motion escape from the police in the Ford Bronco, when he was accused of having murdered his ex-wife, with whom he had a fractious and very dramatic relationship for a number of years, and her friend. And that ended up being one of the trials of the century. 100 million people tuned in to watch the verdict in the O.J. Simpson trial in 1995. But he was found not guilty because they could not prove beyond a reasonable doubt. He lost the civil suit because they could show that the preponderance of the evidence was that he did it, and it really ruined his career. He'd been in a bunch of the Naked Gun movies. He'd been acting in other parts. He really seemed like he was going to have a promising post-football career. He was an announcer for them, and of course that killed all of that. Eventually he got in a bad way with some people over sports memorabilia, so collecting comes into the picture with OJ too, and he felt that it had been stolen from him, so he and a bunch of people went in and robbed it back at gunpoint, and that didn't fly very well, so he was in prison for a while. He actually has been paroled and through all of that and is a free man again. So he's had an interesting and illustrious life, and I think that somebody will find this entertaining either because they're a sports fan, or because they had this when they were a kid, or because there are a lot of people who are interested in infamous celebrities. Now, the next printed material we have to sell is a little kinder and sweeter than that, because this is also an advertising logo, but this advertising logo is a print book with 2 sets of 3 different prints with Chessie the Cat, the advertising logo for the C&O Railroad, which came out in 1933. They had just come up with air-conditioned sleeping cars, and so they wanted to show that it was very, very comfortable and you could sleep like a kitten on the Chesapeake and Ohio Railway. So Chessie the Cat was the original. Then they added Nip and Tuck, her kittens, and then some people who were a little bit prudish at the time were quite concerned that she had kittens and there was no man in the picture. So they came up with this guy here. This is Peek the cat, Chessie's old man, as they put it. I think they were a little annoyed that they had to come up with a male cat just because they had an advertising thing, but you know, it's a more structured time of history. People were not so cool with the not being married thing, and so in that time you had to either have Chessie alone or you had to have Chessie and Peek, because that's why Nip and Tuck the kittens came along, right? So we have all of them. We have 2 of each. That's the way this folio was presented. It's got its original slips of tissue paper between all of the prints. I'll try to hold this up so that you can see that a little bit more. It's really in impeccable condition. And we learned last time selling hat prints to be a little more careful with how we pack them, so we'll be able to get them to the ultimate buyer of this in one piece. And this has a great libretto talking all about Chessie the Cat and how it came to be and how famous and how much fan mail she was getting. It was really an incredibly popular advertising promotion. In 1935, they sold 100,000 calendars with Chessie the Cat on them. So the whole folio of 6 prints are starting out at $19.99. I wanted to show this next piece because it was designed by somebody I really enjoyed, got to know a little bit, and who unfortunately has passed on. This is a ruffled bowl by the Blanco company. So you notice it's a lot more modernist in a way than the Fenton ruffled bowl. They're not trying to be really frilly. They're not trying to do a bunch of exact crimps. It's really more of a handkerchief bowl where you just pull the sides and let it flow, and it's in this great sky blue color. This was designed by Wayne Husted. He died recently in his, I believe, early 90s, but for 4 years when he was producing at Blanco, they tried using an acid mark, Blenko. The problem was they never polished their pontils, so they would put the acid mark over this uneven pontil, and it wouldn't take very well. So you see Blen, and then it kind of just disappears. And that was a real problem with the acid mark. That's why they only used that from 1958 to 1961. Those were not terrific years in the economy, so the production was less in those years. So there are certain Blanco collectors, if they like this era of production, that really specifically look for the acid mark. So that's something you can look for too. Blue color I think is just so great. It's so bright. It's like a Capri blue. It was very popular around 1960. I collect the Capri Blue, the Hazel Atlas glassware. I just love this color. I can certainly see this in my house, but I have so much great Blanco that I've decided to let it go on to someone else. I will put out a video soon where I show where I found this. I was shopping in Kentucky with friends of mine, and I walked right past it, and they noticed it and pointed it out to me. So I've got to give them credit for the fact that I get to bring this piece to you now. It's going to start at just $19.99 because it is a simpler form of Blanco. I'm going to start it at a really low price, close to what I paid for it, and let the collectors decide how much the piece is worth. I suspect it's probably worth somewhere in the $50 range in the current market, but we'll just see. This next piece is a watercolor, and it's an impression by a woman named Jean Leigh Sauls, who was a wave in the Second World War. When she was in the Navy, she was helping with the training simulators for airplanes, and one of the people that she helped train was her eventual husband. He ended up taking them back to Georgia. She also had a graduate degree in art. She really developed a passion and interest for doing impressionist watercolor, and she was considered very good and was eventually asked to do this watercolor for the 1979 Peachtree Run, which is, I believe, a half marathon that happens in Atlanta every year. So these were sold there. It is an original. It has her signature in the corner there. I got this from an estate in Florida. The dad had lived in Georgia for a while and had a business there, and this was on the wall of the business. So it was considered a pretty good piece in its time. I think it's interesting. A lot of her stuff is landscapes, but the Peachtree Run and some of her other pieces like this with group shots, she really focuses on the action and doesn't really focus on the background much at all. You see the skyscrapers of Atlanta are just barely present in the background. So I think it's really interesting work. It's bright, it's happy, it has motion, and it's going to start at $79. She passed on in 2011, and I don't think she had done any work for some period before that. So this is really from about the middle of her career and kind of the peak of her career. And I see that she does sell quite a bit when you look at live auctioneers. When some of the other appraisers on YouTube say, don't just look at eBay. Part of what they're talking about is some of those art pieces. You can look at other records in terms of auctions and in terms of stores and other online listed places of sale. There are lots of places to get information, and especially when you're dealing with art, it trades thinly enough that you know, sometimes a piece gets on eBay, it slips through and it sells cheap because only one person who knows the artist sees it. It's not the same as putting it in an art auction where it's going to be seen by a lot of people who have an interest in the subject necessarily. And so you've got to be watchful of where you're getting your comps. Well, the next piece I was going to show you is a Fenton piece in honor of my friend Heidi at Rosie's Auction House, who's doing her teak stock event in Michigan this weekend. However, the piece had a chip, so that turned into an emergency. And that made me decide to put this on. This is something that I just loved as a child. This is Emergency. This is the Casse-Tête jigsaw puzzle. And it has Randolph Mantooth, who is one of the first Native American actors to be prominently featured in a show. And it has a really great cartoon of a hook and ladder truck from the early 70s. That's what they looked like back then. I thought this was the most exciting show. It says ages 6 to 12. I believe I was 6 when this came on. And boy, I was hooked. I would sit on my dad's lap because it was a little scary. You know, they went to fires and they had to rescue people. I remember one episode where Julie London, who was a famous singer who ended up playing the nurse at the hospital on the show, had to tell a woman that her daughter had died of an overdose. So it was very topical for its time. This is a 200-piece jigsaw puzzle. I think the show ran for about 4 or 5 years. I just remember loving it and then outgrowing it. I think that a lot of the nostalgia for this sort of stuff is that we enjoy being kids again, and this takes us back to when Mom was taking us down the aisle of the store and we saw this puzzle and said, hey, oh, I love that, I want that. And Mom said, no, you can't have it, we have enough junk. And so as a result, now you want it back. That's how childhood collectibles work. This is going to start at $9.99. It is complete. I counted all the pieces are there. They're all in good shape. So you can put this together and have a wonderful time with your 200-piece 11 by 17 puzzle. I made a rookie mistake, and I listened to what a client told me was an attribution on a piece that he gave me, and I had a little bit of a twinge of thinking I should have done a little bit of my own research, but I took it on faith and I got in trouble for it. And I'm really glad that a very friendly eBayer, perhaps a viewer, I'm not sure, was kind enough to set me straight on these, because I really got the cultures wrong and everything. I said that I thought this was a Hopi piece, and it is Navajo. And apparently one of the things I needed to learn, which I'll share with all of you, is that the fur is typical of Navajo dolls and not of Hopi kachinas. Hopi kachinas were made for spiritual reasons, to help young women learn about animism, and the Navajo saw that the Hopis were having success in the later action years selling their interpretations of these to tourists, and they wanted to get in on the act. So they started creating these very fanciful pieces, and some of the artists are well regarded. This particular one is signed H. Largo. And again, I'm very thankful to a fellow eBayer who was kind enough to share this information with me so that I could give you the right information about it. We actually lowered the opening bid because the Navajo pieces are really cool, but they're more flights of fantasy as opposed to, again, having the cultural distinction that a Hopi piece does. So really neat piece. I hope somebody will enjoy it. And it is up for bid with the correct listing information now. It also does have a nice case that it has lived in its entire 35 years. So if you are interested in the piece and you want that to go with it, we can arrange that at extra shipping. Well, we showed this guy a little earlier, and it's time to get him out because he is the penultimate listing for this time. This is from the American Pottery, Evan K. Shaw's Pottery. You see the label right here, and this is Joe Carioca, or Jose Carioca, who is a prominent figure. He was the Brazilian in the Three Caballeros, which was the second of a series of Latin American focused goodwill movies by Disney. This one featured Donald Duck on his 10th anniversary, and one of the big scenes is when he and Joe Carioca dance their way into a book about Brazil, and Jose takes him all through Brazil, shows him lots of interesting people. Donald Duck falls in love with, I believe it's a balloon seller, named Yaya, and then they have to leave the book and go elsewhere. I have to say, I found it a very bewildering movie as a child, but it really, when it came out in 1944, it was really rather significant because it was an attempt by Disney not only to gain fans in Latin America, but also to help the American government heal a lot of old wounds. We had made in military incursions into Mexico as late as the 19 teens under Woodrow Wilson. We were not really great neighbors, and so FDR in the 30s came up with the good neighbor policy to try to help Mexico and be a little bit more integrated, and that resulted in part in Disney. You know, Disney gets a lot of flack for cultural programming and stuff, but honestly, that's always been part of what they've done because that is part of what gives them an international market. So this guy is happily smoking his cigarette. The glaze is all good. The red paint is especially good. That does come off because that's cold painted. And this one's in really, really great shape. So he dates to about 1944, and he's going to start at $49. They can sell for as much as twice that. And the fact that it has the original label is definitely a step in his favor. So we'll see where that ends up. And that brings us to our last piece. And our last piece has whimsy and novelty, but it also has a rather surprising high value. And that is because it is a piece of Red Wing. I'll start by showing you the bottom. We'll keep what it is a surprise till the end. There is the mark, mold number 878. You'd have to be a real Red Wing wonk to know what that is. But if you look at the signature, you notice the upright lettering. That tells you right away this piece is probably from the 1930s, as well as that periwinkle blue glaze. And when we tip it up, it is a howling cat. And there's its little face. Red Wing started doing this sort of pottery in 1936, and this is one of the first pieces they ever made. It's also one of the scarcer pieces that they made because, strangely enough, as cute as it is, it was sold to be an ashtray. You were actually supposed to shove your cigarette or your cigar into the mouth of this thing, and that was what it was used for. Well, most people might have used this as a bed vase or just thought of it as a figurine, but because Red Wing attached this rather peculiar use to it, they didn't really sell very well because companies didn't really understand who the customer was or how to sell this sort of thing if they ordered it as an ashtray. And because of that, it's really, really rather scarce. I have seen these sell as much as $250. We are going to start this one at less than half of that, and we have a buy it now of about $200. These are really not common at all. This is the first time I've ever had one, and I'd actually never seen one before in person until I got this. So I think it's really interesting. I love the color and the glaze. The story is definitely strange, and the fact that it's a cat. People love collecting cats, and this guy definitely has a look. So I think that he'll do well. I'm curious to see how all of this stuff does. I'm so glad that you were able to share this with me. And I just want to say again, thank you so much to our level 2 and 3 members who make this video possible with their contributions. And thank you to all of you who end up purchasing from me. It really is wonderful to bring you things that are interesting and have a good story and give you reasons to want to incorporate them into your home. So thank you for bringing me into your home, and we will see you again very soon.
If you enjoyed this video, check out this one. Also, click thumbs up to like this video and check the description for information about our Patreon, our memberships. We've got a lot of different levels with different perks and bonus videos and early content. Also, please do check out our website, theantiquenomad.com, for appraisal help. And we'll see you again for more adventures in the antique and vintage community soon. Bye for now.